Hi then students, so this is going to be a quick revision video on metaphysical poetry, the general context and features of metaphysical poetry that are important throughout the collection. So we're going to look at key elements and features of metaphysical poetry, some of the key terminology that we need to be able to apply and use in our essays, and of course important concepts. So I've broken down metaphysical poetry, some of the key ideas into some of the historical context, history and society, things along those lines. The definition of the metaphysical is always quite important as well. So the way in which we define metaphysical poetry, the different things it can mean, the type of things it includes. Key features would be just the stuff that's sort of going to come up again and again, that sort of tendencies of the whole movement, and then some of the key concepts, some of the ideas that are perhaps bigger than a feature or that sort of are explored a little bit within metaphysical poetry. So we'll start with the definition then. So, literally the idea of the metaphysical. Meta's got several different terms, like above or beyond or after. So, like the sort of like after the physical or beyond the physical in some sort of way. So that could include things along the lines of sort of like, you know, literally the sort of the supernatural, in that sense, like the beyond the natural world, the supernatural. It could mean the specific supernatural ideas of such as the divine, but it can also mean like more than physical, like certain existential or logical issues. So things like sort of love and concepts that sort of perhaps transcend description in those ways. So it's to do with those more than physical things. Okay. A key idea of the definition, of course, that it is a 17th century movement, which we might call sort of like what we call Baroque, is one of the ways of describing it. And of course, important in terms of the definition is that the metaphysical poets themselves did not think of themselves as part of a particular movement, and they didn't term themselves metaphysical poets until, in fact, the whole idea of the metaphysical poet wasn't invented until I think it was 1750s, 1760s, at least 100 or 150 years later, by Dr. Johnson. He first came up with the term and was actually a bit disparaging about it as well. Okay, so the big idea is that it's sort of a philosophical approach to poetry, and it's questions sort of the nature of reality, the nature of things, the nature of nature, really. Is there anything beyond it? Philosophical questioning, things along those lines. Whereas, of course, a lot of poetry is about the representation of experience, or often, as in, say, romantic poetry, it's about nature and being attuned to and representing the power of nature, whereas this is very different. It's about questions and arguments and the structures that we use, things along those lines. Okay, history and some of the concepts that you need to be able to be okay with in order to discuss about physical poetry and put it in context. Obviously, there's lots of things that are going on, but the sort of big ideas that we're talking to would be this idea of the Reformation, which sort of began in the 16th century, the Reformation, and the religious upheaval that happened in the 17th century throughout it. So obviously Protestants and Catholics, but the conflicts between those in various wars, etc. But we're also talking really about Puritanism, Lutheranism, and Calvinism. So the Puritans, I can't even spell the word, I beg your pardon. Puritanism, and Calvinism, things along those lines. Okay, and the ideas of predestination and things that are associated with Calvinism, and the sort of stoicism that's associated with Puritanism. Puritans being people who are sort of anti-hedonistic, didn't believe in pleasure and things along those lines. And Calvinism, people who believed in sort of predestination. You're predestined for either heaven or hell, and there's nothing you can do about it, really. Okay, politically, of course, we've got the question of the state and of power. So that culminates in the Civil War, which is essentially about the power of the king. So what's more important, is the king appointed by God, the Sun King, the divine ruler in that sense, God's emissary on earth, something along those lines, or is the state sort of a contract between people, and so does the king or the prince. Are they somebody who sort of upholds the law and is subject to the law rather than the person who sets the law? And that culminates in the Civil War, where those ideas lead to huge sort of warring factions. Okay, and then we've also got the idea of colonization beginning as well, which is much more about exploration and mapping in the 17th century than it is about ownership, really. exploration and mapping. So this is sort of 17th century sort of the discovery of new worlds, and we get what we call like exoticism, this idea of being very exotic and finding anything of the East or the Indies, whether that's West or actual India, of being sort of exotic and interesting and a place to be explored, things along those lines. Okay. Let's go through some of the key features then. So one of the most important things is that this idea that it's sort of spoken quality. Now, some metaphysical poets are lyrical in the sense that you can actually sort of sing them in that way. They're sort of designed to be sung in that sense. They have rhyme schemes that are lyrical, but quite a lot are non-lyrical, and many of them have this sort of spoken, almost sort of conversational quality. Okay, this sort of conversational element, and of course that's linked to the fact that it's often in the sense it's often a sort of passive recipient. So it's often second person, and it's often female. The recipient is something that gives it this spoken quality, like it's speaking to a loved one. Okay, obviously hyperbole is a massive part of metaphysical poetry, sort of crafting of deep metaphors, complex metaphors, but exaggerating the effects, things along those lines, and a freedom, a sort of a liberal take on structure. Now, they'll often be sort of structured in terms of arguments or stanzas, might even have a particular rhyme scheme, but sort of they're non-constrained is what we'd call it, sort of non-constrained structures. So you often get structures that change, or rhyme schemes that change, or it doesn't continue with a particular verse, something along those lines. Okay. This word is a really important one, the use of analogy. So anything where one thing's shown to be another. So types of metaphor and simile, but something's a bit like something else. You know, something's a bit like this, a bit like that. I'm going to get over there in a minute when it's sort of a key concept of the conceit, but this linking things together that you wouldn't normally link together. Have you ever thought this is a bit like that? So one of the things that they do. Okay, and part of that would be these things like paradoxes and contrasts and things along those lines. So some of the things they're trying to discuss are impossible to discuss. I mean, this is one of the key points about the metaphysical poets, that the things they're attempting to discuss can't be discussed. Now, you know, as myself as sort of a methodological naturalist, really, I think I can't see how we can discuss the supernatural meaningfully, because by definition it's sort of, you know, beyond the natural, so we can't investigate it. So just by dint of that fact, you're sort of constrained to the natural world. So one of the things that's happening in the 17th century and 18th centuries after it is this question of what we call like spectral testimony. So it used to be that, you know, if you were possessed by a demon or something like that, or, you know, there's witches and things along those lines, that you could actually have, you know, testimony from the dead or spirits or beyond the grave, or, you know, they turned me into a newt or something and I got better, you know, to quote Monty Python. But there's this big question about whether you can do that, because we get the start of the sort of science. That's another thing that we're getting, beginnings of science. That's sort of Newton, and the beginnings of sort of a scientific resolution and a sort of rationalist sort of in the broader sense, reason and rationalism in the 17th century. But if you're going to talk about something like God or the afterlife, or even something like love, ultimately you're going to come across a paradox. It won't make sense. It will be something that sort of just can't be discussed logically. And some of those paradoxes are what sort of fuels metaphysical poetry. Just big things that you can't make sense of, you know, like death and things like that. There's a big obsession with those things. Okay, and then really important is this use of irony and wit. So wit, think Stephen Fry, you know, irony, not really meaning it. You've got to be careful with this when you're analysing metaphysical poets from, say, a feminist perspective. You say, oh, look how sexist John Donne is, and, you know, look at the way in which he, you know, sort of commodifies the female body and all these things, which is fine. But if we don't take into account the fact that a tendency in the genre was irony and hyperbole, that it was taking an idea for a walk, that it was going over the top for sort of almost comical or rhetorical effect rather than actually meaning it, then we're going to miss out on some potential sort of accuracy with our analyses, really. Okay, so on to some big concepts then. Well, obviously the most important one would be this idea of the metaphysical conceit. metaphysical conceit. I didn't do that very well, did I? Metaphysical conceit. So a type of analogy, and it's usually between something sort of base and physical, or sort of a small physical object, a sort of microcosmic physical object, and a larger metaphysical idea, or something that could be seen as metaphysical, or at the very least bigger. So sort of a microcosm plus a macrocosm, really. So classic ones would be things like, and they're non-visual as well. So they're usually just, oh, you thought this is a bit like that. So, in what way is God a window? There's no way that God looks like a window, doesn't look like anything, but you're sort of drawing similarities and analogies, and often in a sort of quite playful and unusual way, and often almost seemingly like a semi-blasphemous way. So when Dunn refers to, the sun as sort of busy old fool, all that type of thing, unruly and all these types of things, the sun might be seen as a sort of a metaphor for power of the king, but also potentially even God there. So almost a sort of playful, blasphemous, almost semi-blasphemous attitude towards things. And so like if I say, have you ever thought, that God is a bit like a watch? This, or the universe is a bit like, and what I'm doing is sort of drawing connections between things. I'm not saying that they're directly comparable, I'm just taking ideas for a walk. And so that metaphysical conceit is really important. Another concept is this conflict, or the dichotomy between, there's just this sort of the contrast between the transcendent, you have to be okay with this word, the transcendent, and its opposite, the transient. So it's not the case that the metaphysical poets are only interested in the transcendent. They are actually interested in the transient as well, the natural world. It's just that they're interested in the relationship between the two, or the lack of ability to describe one over the other. So the transcendent would be anything that sort of lasts forever, anything that is supernatural, or anything that sort of goes beyond, so God and things like that, but also like sort of laws of logic, like 1 + 1 = 2, that'll be true for all time. People who are really, really romantic in their attitude to love, I'll love you forever. You still see that idea where soulmates, it'll last forever. Things that are perfect and perfectly mingled can't ever be undone. That idea. And then the transient is like the natural, which is changeable and time bound. So everything transient changes, everything transient sort of dies and falls away. So that conflict and contrast and the relationship between those things, what's transcendent and what's transient. Some of you are going to be saying, well, everything's transient, Phil, ultimately, because the universe will die, and all those types of things, but the nihilists amongst you. But some of you might have a belief in certain transcendent things, that maybe even your own souls and things like that you think might last forever in some way. Or maybe love, you think that might last forever. So it's the idea of the eternal, the forever, the perfect, almost the Platonic ideal versus the sort of the changeable and the everyday and the natural. Okay, and the real, really, things that are really there in the natural world, the messy natural world of your senses. Okay, the idea of meditation is also something that's with sort of religious connotations to the meditative style of poetry, but a meditation is a sort of a thoughtful musing on an idea, but it's not pushing anything. You sort of try and take your ego away from it, really. Meditative sort of style, a bit like mindfulness, I suppose. So this meditation on something, allowing ideas to come forth by concentrating on a particular object. If I meditated on a cup, maybe other ideas would come to the fore, things along those lines. Okay, and then finally this idea is the question of sort of unnaturalness. So this is one of the criticisms of the movement by later Romantic poets, was that there was something unnatural. Now, it's not true to say that the metaphysical poets weren't interested in nature. There's some beautiful pastoral imagery in a lot of the metaphysical poetry, but I think what they meant by this is that because there's a sort of argumentative, almost quality to metaphysical poetry, that it's sort of often it's structured as an argument, or that it's trying to force an idea, or it's trying to be witty or having a conversation, that it's not a sort of natural response. It's not about your feelings or your natural emotions. It's more about trying to push an idea or push an understanding, which Romantic poets didn't really like later. They wanted things to just be spontaneously generated and natural and true in that sense, rather than taking complicated ideas for walks. I think a bit of both go as well. Okay, so overall then, most important things that we remember, some stuff about the history, obviously about the definition, the fact that it's about things after the physical world, not just God, but anything that's not simply physical, anything beyond and transcendent. Some key features of the ironic tone and the wittiness, paradox, hyperbole, the uses of analogy and the passive female recipient, and then some of the key ideas of the metaphysical conceit and this transcendent versus transient, these elements, and whether it's a sort of pushing an argument and pushing thoughts rather than just a natural sort of response, or naturally painting the world as it is beautifully, as the Romantic poets would have liked. Okay, I hope that's helpful. Thank you.